All right. Good morning, Mount Olive. It's good to see everybody this Monday morning. It's Labor Day. Many of us have off work today, and so we're enjoying today. That's why the devotion is later today. I've slept in a little bit. I'm wearing my hat today that says Jesus is my boss. Brother Carmel Shell got me that, and I need to make sure that my desires are the same as God's plans for my life. That's something Jody preached about yesterday. And one thing I'm struggling with today is I'm looking in my mirror. I guess we'd say we'll call it my rear view mirror here, as you see it. And as I look at that, I'm looking at yesterday. I'm looking at what I did yesterday, looking at the mistakes of yesterday, looking at the disagreements of yesterday, looking at how I messed things up yesterday. And if I continue to do that today, I'm not going to be able to enjoy this beautiful day off and this Labor Day if I let those things take my sleep and affect my day. And that's what I want to talk to us about today. We're going to start a series. Let me share my screen. We're going to start, for this devotion this week, we're going to start talking about Exodus chapter 14. And we want to talk about trusting God. And today's lesson is the rear view mirror. And we're going to look at Exodus 14, verses 8 through 12. Again, we want to learn this week in our devotion how to trust God, trusting God. Okay? All right. So the theme for this week, the theme verse that you're going to get for this week is verse 31 of chapter 14. And Israel saw that great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. This is our memory verse for this week. So I want you to memorize this. This is our theme verse for this week. So the theme for this week is seeing all that God has done and learning to trust him with all that we have. Okay, so we pick up the story here as we talk about the Hebrews, which are the Israelites. And so the Hebrews, in their, the backdrop of this story, in the history of their nation, they began as a people through a man named Jacob. And then Jacob had sons, and there came a time of a famine in the land. And so Jacob's sons moved to Goshen, which is in the land of Egypt. That's where their brother was sent before them, named Joseph. And there they had, out of Joseph's wisdom in Egypt, they had kept back plenty in time for the drought and time for the famine. And so it was that move that took the Hebrew people into Egypt. Well, there was a Pharaoh that rose up and didn't know these men and their goodness. And so he began to enslave the Hebrews. He made them slaves, and then they actually became slaves under a hard taskmaster. They were whipping them with whips and making them work and having them in chains and really oppressing the people. And so the children of Israel, or the Hebrews, they cried out to God, the true God. And God sent them a leader named Moses. And we know that story, and how that Moses, through the miracles of the plagues of God, convinced Pharaoh to let his people go. And I know a lot of you call me the Pharaoh preacher because I have a hard time letting my people go on Sunday morning, right? So he really didn't want to let these slaves go because they were prospering, right? They were multiplying, but they were prospering. And so Pharaoh let these people go, and now he's having second thoughts. And so this is where we're at. After all the plagues and all the miracles that God sent, Pharaoh set the people free. And then he started having second thoughts. Let's look and see what it says in verse 7. And he took 600 chosen chariots. Now this is 600 of his very best, riding chariots with spears and arrows and bows and swords, and all the chariots of Egypt, and the captains over every one of them, his full force of his military. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued after the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with a high hand. And so, in other words, this is the danger of rejecting God's offer. Pharaoh continued to reject God as God revealed himself to him time and time again over the plagues. And then the last plague was a sickness, a disease, a pandemic that took his own son. By the hand of God, this disease fell, and it took Pharaoh's own son. Pharaoh allowed the people to go, but now he's having second thoughts, and he again rejects God. And there is a point, isn't there? There is a point, I believe, that you can reject God to the extreme. And by your own choice, your own freedom of your will, God will harden your heart. And that's what happened here with Pharaoh. If someone's listening to me today, and God has been offering himself to you, God has been speaking to you, God has been trying to direct you, and you have continued to reject him, I want you to remember verse 8. I want you to remember verse 8. I remember the day that I rededicated my life, I felt like that my heart was being hardened by my rejection. And so beware of that, okay? So we look here in verse 9, but the Egyptians pursued after them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them or caught them by the sea. And so what we find here now is that we get this image, right? The Hebrew people here are not a nation. They don't have military. They don't have soldiers. They don't have swords. They got cattle, right? Maybe they left Egypt with some cattle, a high hand. They left Egypt with some fruit, cucumbers. So here comes Pharaoh with all of his mighty army, and all we got is cucumbers. This is a bad look, right? And so we see here at the path of the children of Israel. If you look up in the top left, you'll see the land of Goshen. That's where they are, by the Nile River. That's around Egypt. So they left there, and the obvious track, right, would be northeast. You see that little dotted line? Northeast, up the coast of the Great Sea. That's where Pharaoh thought that they would go. He thought that these people had been lost, but we know that God was directing them. How? How was he directing them? A cloud by day. They didn't have to worry about that sun. God was the cloud for them, right? They walked in the shade. We're having service outside. We got to try to put up shade. Oh, God's people had shade, right? We're putting tents up everywhere in the parking lot of Mount Olive, if you've seen it. They didn't need tents. They had a shade. It was God's presence. And it was a fire by night. They didn't need a campfire at night to get warm. God provided them a fire by night. So it was a cloud by day and a fire by night. God will provide. But God's direction was different than the clear path. God's direction was different than the easy path. God's direction was different than what seemed to be the right way. God took them down towards the wilderness in a long route, as you see those red arrows, and even to the border of the Red Sea. And so right there at the Red Sea, you see where they were entrapped. The devil behind them, the Red Sea in front of them. Let's look at takeaway number 1, verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew nigh, he's really getting close now, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. I love that word, sore. Man, we went hiking the other day, and we went hiking to the Devil's Bathtub. Yeah, your pastor went to the Devil's Bathtub. And we got done, and we were sore all over. Man, it was pain. They were so afraid. They were in pain in their soul, in their mind, in their heart. They were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. First of all, from strong faith to great fear. That's your first point. How quickly they went from strong faith to great fear. I want you to imagine people who cried out to God and prayed, and they were under the oppression of the mightiest hand of all the world. This Pharaoh, Egyptian civilization, was the ruling civilization of the world at the time. And by miracles, this God had delivered them. And 2.5 to 3 million people, counting men, women, and children, walked out in rags, barely had shoes. And they walked out of there overcoming the oppression of Pharaoh, set free by the power of God. I see them walking in an orderly fashion. I see them walking proudly. But just days after, look at how quick. Days after, how quickly their faith grew to great fear. How quickly their faith grew to great fear. Why? They were literally caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. You ever heard that phrase? They were caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. There was an unmovable obstacle in front of them and a powerful enemy coming to kill them behind them. Now, let's don't be too critical on these people, because we realize many times in life, like a pandemic, a coronavirus, a disease, problems with our finances, many times there's unmovable objects. It seems to be impossible objects in front of us. And we know there's a powerful enemy coming behind us. He's as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And many times we are the ones that we go to church on Sunday, we lift the hands and praise God, and we have strong faith. But then throughout the week, we find ourselves falling to great fear. But I want you to remember something. When the opposition comes, you are ripe for a miracle. I want you to write that down. When the opposition comes, you are ripe for a miracle. All right, number 2. And when Pharaoh drew nigh to the children of Israel, the children of Israel, verse 10, lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were so afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. You see, they realized they were helpless and hopeless. Have you ever been there? It was in Egypt. They were helpless and hopeless with rags and chains and whips. And they called out to God, and God delivered them through the miracles he brought through their leader Moses. Now, after being set free, they're in their journey through the wilderness. Remember, that path was not the clear and easy path, but it was the path through the wilderness, around about. And now they're in another situation where they're helpless and hopeless. If they were going to be saved and delivered in Egypt to overcome their chains, it had to be a move of God. Again, if they're going to be saved, delivered in this instant, it has to be a move of God. And I find this a picture of the Christian life. Egypt represents the world and a life of sin. And there came a time in TJ's life when I realized I was helpless and hopeless, enslaved by sin, couldn't come out of my sin, couldn't overcome my sin, couldn't come out of being enslaved to the world. I didn't like the life. It was a life of oppression. But I was helpless and hopeless, on my knees before God, and Jesus Christ saved me. And he can do that for you today if you'll just cry out to him and say, Jesus, forgive me my sins and save me today. But now I realize I'm not in heaven yet. I've not got to the promised land. I'm just in rags, walking around in the wilderness of this world, waiting to get home. Now it's the journey of the faith of the Christian life. And it also shows us there'll be times when we feel helpless and hopeless. But if we're going to be saved, if we're going to be delivered, it must be only by the hand of God. Somebody feels helpless and hopeless today. There's a God in heaven. There's a God who's listening. He'll incline his ear. He'll lean forth his hand. And all we have to do is, as this verse says at the end, cry out unto the Lord. And then our last point. First point, they went from faith to fear. Second point, they were helpless and hopeless, crying out to God. Last point. And they said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, well, there's pyramids, there's mummies everywhere. They have one of the greatest or most sophisticated burial medicine and embalming of any civilization ever. The Egyptians. He says, but there were no graves in Egypt? You're taking us to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us this way to bring us out of Egypt? Verse 12, is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone? Why don't you just leave us alone? We want to be slaves. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. I want you to look at that. It'd been better for us to be slaves. I want you, 2 things here I want to see. They're looking in the rear view. They're looking back. And as they look back, when you look back for so long, you'll have a desire to go back. They literally wanted to go back to whips and chains. And if you continue to look back long enough, you'll get a desire to go back. And that's a good message for us. If you're looking back today at your mistakes, your yesterdays, you can't enjoy your today. If you're looking at your past, your failures, or the life of sin that you used to be in, if you stare long enough, you'll find a desire in you to go back, to quit on your marriage, to quit on your job, to quit on the things of God, your ministry, to go back to sin and to the world. You see, there's one thing that they forgot. They forgot the very reason they cried out to God in the first place. They forgot what pitiful lot that they were in. They couldn't stand it any longer, couldn't live that way one more day. And they cried out to God, and God saved them. And now because he's directing them in a way that's different, a way that they don't find agreeable, they're looking back. And they may want to go back. I think this is the major point today. You know, I remember a story of Hannah. We were driving through Wise, the town of Wise, and she had just got her license. And I finally said, honey, slow down. You're driving too fast. And of course, hurt her feelings a little bit. And I said, why do you do that? And she said, because, Dad, I can't look at the road and the speedometer at the same time. So she hadn't learned to kind of feel the RPMs of the vehicle to know she's been speeding up. Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth? There's a reason the windshield is bigger than the rear view. Where you're going is so much better than where you've been. Where you're going is your future. You can't see the future if you're constantly looking in the rear view at your past. The past is like using your rear view mirror in the car. It's good to glance back every once in a while and see how far you've come. But if you stare too long, you're going to miss out on this Labor Day. What's right in front of you, your blessings. And then Warren Wiersbe, you do not move ahead by constantly looking in a rear view mirror. The past is just a rudder to guide you, not the anchor to drag you. We must learn from the past, but not live in the past. I want to prevent somebody this morning from looking in their rear view and looking at their yesterdays and missing out on what they have for today. We hope that God has blessed you in this devotion. Have a wonderful one.